It was a muggy Tuesday morning in August when James Smith, a newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car in the heart of Blue Ridge, a small city tucked away in the rolling hills of North Carolina. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans and scuffed sneakers, he didn't look the part of a man who had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement. That was exactly his intention. James believed in seeing things for what they truly were, not through the polished lens of scheduled meetings or rehearsed welcomes. As a black man stepping into a leadership role in a precinct plagued by whispers of misconduct, he wanted to observe the department unfiltered. What better way to do that than to blend? The precinct's parking lot buzzed with officers coming and going. James scanned the area, noting the casual banter and occasional glances his way. No one seemed to recognize him, which was unsurprising. His appointment had been announced just days ago, and he had chosen not to publicize his arrival until the official inspection later that morning. He adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and took a deep breath. The weight of his mission, to root out the toxicity festering within the department, pressed heavy on his shoulders. He was no stranger to resistance, but he knew this job would test him in ways he hadn't yet. As the faint sound of laughter carried through the air, James stepped through the precinct's side entrance unnoticed, among the hum of casual chatter and ringing phones. The tiled floors glistened under harsh fluorescent lights, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. He walked slowly, observing the dynamics around him. Groups of officers huddled near desks, some swapping stories, others reviewing paperwork. No one paid him much attention until he paused near the break room. "Hey you!" A sharp voice cut through the noise. James turned to see a white officer striding toward him, a smug grin plastered on his face. His badge read Officer Johnson. Behind him, a few others leaned against the wall, watching with interest. James opened his mouth to speak, but Johnson didn't give him the "Lost, are we? This isn't a shelter," the officer said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You need to take that mess," the words landing like a punch. He wasn't sure whether to correct the man immediately or let the scene unfold further. Before he could decide, Johnson stepped closer, his voice rising for the benefit of his audience. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter erupted from the onlookers, and James clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. He tried to speak, but Johnson leaned in, his face inches away. Then, without warning, the officer spat straight into James. Time seemed to stop. James's breath hitched as the warm saliva dripped down his cheek. Around him, the laughter grew louder. One officer slapped the table, doubling over in amusement, while another muttered something about showing the riffraff their place. James's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears, but he kept his composure. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his face, his movements slow. "Is everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Johnson smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." The group burst into laughter again, but James said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked down the hallway, leaving the officers behind as he headed toward the precinct's main. An intercom crackled to life, calling all personnel to the briefing room. The briefing room was abuzz with chatter as officers filed in, some carrying coffee mugs, others laughing over inside jokes. James entered through a side door, now holding a folder that bore the precinct's official seal. He stood just out of view, watching the room fill with familiar faces, some still chuckling from the earlier incident. At the front of the room, Captain Brown, a stout man with a graying mustache, called for, "All right, settle down everyone. We've got an important introduction." Their curiosity piqued. Johnson leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, a smug expression still plastered on his face. The man was clearly enjoying his morning. Captain Brown cleared his throat. "As most of you know, Chief Miller retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this." James forward, his footsteps measured. The room froze as he walked to the podium, his presence commanding attention. He placed the folder on the lectern and slowly scanned the room. His calm demeanor only heightened the tension. Johnson's smirk faltered, the color draining from his face as recognition dawned. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering, others staring at James with wide eyes. Good morning, James began, his voice steady. My name is James Smith. As of today, I'm your new... The sound was deafening. Johnson's face turned a deep shade of red, his bravado evaporating. James's gaze landed on him, holding for a moment longer than necessary before sweeping across the rest of the room. When I arrived this morning, James continued, I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see the department through an unfiltered lens. What I witnessed was through the crowd, but James raised a hand to silence it. In my brief time here, I've already seen behaviors that are not just unprofessional but downright unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today. The room remained eerily quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Johnson shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. James took a step closer to the edge of the podium, his tone sharp but respect is not optional. It's the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we serve. He let the silence hang for a moment, watching the officers squirm under his gaze. This morning, some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place. But let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a badge. Through the room like a blade. No one dared to move. James let the silence linger, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the room was palpable, each officer acutely aware of the weight of his words. Johnson shifted again, his discomfort evident as beads of sweat formed on his brow. But James wasn't done. I understand that change is difficult, he said, his voice steady but laced with authority. But let me be clear. There will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of any individual, whether they are a colleague, a civilian, or any. He stepped down from the podium, walking slowly toward the officers, his presence commanding yet his tone carrying a controlled intensity. Officer Johnson, James said, stopping just a few feet away from Johnson, his bravado from earlier completely dissolved. You, James continued, locking eyes with him, represent everything that's broken in this department. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath, and the community we swore to protect. Johnson stammered, Chief, I... That's exactly the problem, James interrupted, his voice sharp. You didn't care to know. You didn't take a moment to think before you acted because you assumed that man standing in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption is why this department has lost the trust of the people. The silent, every officer frozen in place. James turned his attention to the rest of the group. What I witnessed wasn't just one man's mistake, it was a culture. A culture where bullying and prejudice are not only tolerated but celebrated, and that stops now. He stepped back toward the podium, his voice rising slightly. I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just in the streets, but within the walls of departments like this one. Change isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But I promise you this, as long as I'm chief, this precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and James, letting his words sink in, then with a slight nod toward Captain Brown, he concluded, effective immediately, Officer Johnson is suspended pending an internal investigation, and for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is the first of many changes. Gumbled through the room. Johnson's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening as he avoided the stares of his peers. James, unfazed, stood tall. This isn't about punishment, he said firmly. It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to rise to it, this isn't the place for you. He glanced around the room one last time, his eyes locking with each officer's. If you're ready to do better, to be better, then we'll move forward together. But know this, I will hold you accountable every... The meeting ended with a heavy silence, officers shuffling out of the room without their usual chatter. James remained at the podium for a moment, watching as Johnson stormed out, his face a mix of embarrassment and anger. The other officers avoided eye contact, their expressions ranging from guilt to quiet Back in his office, James sat down at his desk, exhaling deeply. He knew this was just the beginning. Years of entrenched attitudes wouldn't change overnight, and for some they might never change at all. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to make friends. He came to make the phone on. It was Captain Brown. "Chief, I wanted to say you handled that better than most would have," Brown said, his voice tentative. "Thanks, Captain," James replied, "but the real work starts now. I need a full review of Johnson's history on my desk by tomorrow. Complaints, incident reports." "You've got it," Brown said before hesitating. "And Chief, I think you shook a few of them today." Allow a brief moment of satisfaction before diving into the mountain of paperwork in front of him. Over the next few weeks, the precinct was a different place. Officers who once laughed at Johnson's antics now avoided him altogether, whispers of his suspension spreading through the department. James made it a point to walk the halls regularly, greeting everyone he passed, his presence a constant reminder of his leadership. Some officers took the change to heart. Officer Davis, a younger recruit, approached James one day, admitting that she'd been complicit in the toxic culture out of fear of "I want to do better, Chief," she said. James replied, his voice kind but firm. "It starts with you." But not everyone was willing to change. Johnson filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. James held his ground, standing firm in his belief that accountability wasn't optional. The department's review uncovered a string of previous complaints against Johnson, ranging from excessive force to inappropriate comments. His appeal was denied, and James made it clear that the days of brushing misconduct under the rug. Despite the progress, James knew the road ahead would be long. Conversations about implicit bias and community relations were met with mixed reactions, but he remained undeterred. Each small victory, a recruit speaking up, an officer rethinking their approach, was a step towards something. One morning, James attended a community event where he met a young boy who shyly approached him. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, his eyes wide. "I am," James said. "My police don't care about us," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. James crouched down to meet his gaze. "I can't change the past, but I promise we're working to do better," he said gently. "And if you ever need help, you come find me." The boy nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. It was moments like this that reminded James why he had taken the job in the By the end of last year, the precinct was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. Officers who couldn't adapt were gone, replaced by recruits who shared James's vision for a fair and respectful department. The community, once skeptical, began to see signs of change, a renewed effort to build trust and bridge divides. James' main hallway one evening, watching as officers filed out after their shifts. The laughter and camaraderie felt different now, not at someone's expense, but genuine and inclusive. He knew there would always be challenges ahead, but for the first time he felt hopeful. Change was never easy, but it was worth every fight.